Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Amri Johnson, your host. I hope you're well. Join me as we continue to deconstruct the shortcomings of traditional DEI strategies and co-create a vision for more transformative, human-centered approaches to inclusion. Myself and my esteemed guests will challenge the status quo, dive deep into the reactive, supplemental nature of many DEI initiatives. We'll explore how to reclaim the profound and transformational potential of inclusion as a catalyst for collective growth, empowerment, and organizational change. Season 2 of the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast starts now. Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Amri Johnson. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by Dr. Jonathan. And there's other, obviously, things about his name that will add to it, the Ashong-Lamptey. But Dr. Jonathan is who I know him by, and I'm just delighted to have you here with us today, Dr. Jonathan.
Amri, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be part of your podcast, part of your message, and your ongoing work. So I know we've been talking about this for the benefit of the audience. We've been talking about this for a very long time. So I'm glad that we finally found time to make it happen.
Me too. Before we jump into the questions, Jonathan, what I want people to know is that in terms of really trying to create the conditions for organizations and their people to thrive, Dr. Jonathan has been perhaps one of the most, if not the most generous person on social media that I've encountered. And it hasn't been just rhetoric. It's been really thorough, evidence-based, both practiced as well as from the academic research, consistent, clear, sharp, and open to engagement about it, whether you agree with it or not. And that is something that kept me always tuned in. And so I want to thank you for that. And I want the audience to know that, if you want credible, I'm all right, but Dr. Jonathan's the man. All right. So just if you're not engaging with him in some way, shape, or form, he has lots of ways that you can make sure that you do. And we'll make sure that we have information about where you can engage with him in the show notes.
So thank you so much. I need to, you can't just say that and let me not respond to something, because you've been very kind. Okay. You've been very kind. You've been very gracious, but I also want to refer to you, to defer to you in particular, because I read a lot of books, and we'll get into that in terms of inclusion and the space. And when I picked up your book, you may not remember, and this isn't something you would share yourself, but I'd gone through a couple of pages, I stopped, and it was part sort of anger, part encouragement. Okay. So the encouragement was, look, this is very well written. This is great. Like, I read a lot of books. This is written better than most of the books. I like what you've done here. And then there was a little bit of anger because I was saying, but why am I only learning about this now after buying the book? Why? And this is, and once again, this is me kind of, letting people peer behind the curtain. I've been saying to your gracious host, look, there's so much that you've got here, which I know you share. And I know you yourself have various means that people can get it. But I was saying the quality of what's here, just please share it more. And so that was my sort of angry, like, why now?
It was a very British angry, y'all.
Yes.
So, it's a very different angry than the American angry. It was kind of like angry that, hey man, this is decent stuff, and I read a lot of stuff, and you need to get to moving. And He motivated me. I got a little, I upped my LinkedIn game a little bit, but he's still encouraging me to up it. So I'm working on that. But I got a role model in how that's done with excellence right in front of me. So before we jump into the full questions, Doc, we always ask people a favorite song or movie that you go to over and over again. And then I have one more question for you after that. So a favorite song or movie that you go to over and over again.
So there's a song I've been listening to a lot. I've always loved it, and I find it to be very inspirational. And it's Buju Banton and Beres Hammond. And it's actually a remix. It's one of those one drop remixes, and it's called "I'm Gonna Do My Best." Right? I don't know if you can put a
I
link for
actually
that in the
am
show notes.
familiar with it. And so I got a little chill when you said it because I it's inspiring.
It is inspiring. It's very encouraging, and it's literally saying, you know, you're going to do your best. You're going to go for it. You're going to make everything. You know, you're not going to leave anything on the table. You're not going to let it go past. And some of the lyrics as well. I love it. I love it.
Yeah,
and
that's
one
fantastic.
I go back to. I have been going back to a lot recently. So when you asked me, I thought actually that is something that, and it's upbeat as well. And positive.
Yeah. We need positive these days more than ever. Yeah, I have something to add to that around a Peter Tosh song that I really like that called "I Am What I Am." I think that's my paraphrasing of it. So those two songs, I'm familiar with both, and that's what came to mind. So thank you for that. I'm gonna do my best too.
Yes, we all will.
One book or one person that has influenced or inspired you personally or professionally in life or in your career?
So the one person is clearly definitely my mother. And this sounds like an acceptance speech. But I'm going to give you two, right? So I like when I did my PhD, literally, I think it's the second page. It's like for my mother. So huge inspiration. I was raised by a single mother on a council estate in Greater London, which is social housing. So, and everyone in my family, they love, I'm from a Ghanaian family, so everyone likes education and loves education. So if you've got a PhD, it's like the thing. Like when I got a PhD, members of my family who I've never spoken to before or after appeared just to say hi, just to call, just to text. They love it. They absolutely love it. And the commitment to education. So she liked it. And when I said I was doing it, she wasn't really surprised, which I was. So that's a whole different thing. So I want to acknowledge my mother there.
No, I love it.
But
I love it.
Something more practical, because I like to be practical in giving people some guidance. And a book that absolutely changed my relationship with work, I would say. And it's the book I gift the most to people early in their career. And it's called So Good They Can't Ignore You. So Good They Can't Ignore You by Professor Cal Newport, who is also the author of Deep Work. People talk, this is a great book as well. People talk about that. I knew about Professor Cal Newport, and maybe even before he was a professor, actually. Right. And this book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, it debunks the idea of follow your passion when you're at work or with regards to your career. So if you remember, I very briefly touched on how I grew up, my personal upbringing. So I grew up in an environment, like socially, where people talked about work, not career. So people had a job as well. People didn't like what they did. They did it for the money. And I grew up with that mindset. And what was so powerful about this book is it first off says that work can be something you can enjoy and get value from.
Right.
Let's focus on the value from. It's something that could be a source of satisfaction for you as an individual. That's a big deal for me. And what he says is, in order for you to be able to get that, you need to develop rare and valuable skills. And this is something that has completely changed my relationship with work and my approach to work and development and career and all of those things. compared to the way I grew up, and frankly, compared to the way everyone else does it as well. So
Sure.
that book is a huge impact. I gift this. Like if I met you and you were in your early 20s or something, I have copies of this book in my car.
Wow.
Yeah. So
It's like it's like your mixtape.
absolutely. Except I give it away, right?
You're not selling it, you're giving it away. I got it. I
I
love
give
it.
it away. Yeah. So
I love it.
that's how important it is. I still read it. I still talk about it. It guides my decisions now.
Yeah, I like that because you probably know at this point that I'm really big on agency, and skills are a big part of your agency. And they're actually the place where there's the greatest disparity, oftentimes
Mhm.
when we're talking about discrimination versus disparity, which the economists talk about a lot, but the DEI people only talk about disparity, right? I mean, about discrimination. And I mean, I do a little bit of exaggerating with DEI people because I think sometimes we go a little too far with our kind of feelings. Not that I don't have feelings, Dr. Jonathan, but
I'm with
they're
you.
not
I am
they're not
with
the only
you.
thing I have. So skills, and then be so good that they have to be like, wow, this person is extraordinary. And that's, to me, that place where you can really guide your future rather than feel like somebody else has some type of hold or hand on the rudder of your future. So I love that. I love it, love it, love it. So you've shared a little bit of your background so far, Doc. Share a little bit more about your background, what you're working to create in the world. I feel like I could fill in here because I've just watched how much you've put out and I absorbed it. But could you tell people what you're trying to create in the world where your work is concerned?
Sure. Great. And thank you. Thank you for asking. And you're right. I think because I repeat it so often and I repeat it to myself as well. And so the way I normally introduce myself is to say that I'm Dr. Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey. Everyone calls me Dr. Jonathan, and I'm the founder of the Element of Inclusion, right? And we work with organizations to make them inclusive. Now, typically that meant research, training, and consulting, but I'm on a mission to help 1 million people like you to make your workplace inclusive. And the way that we do that is through a system called evidence-based inclusion. And so I really am the evangelist. I want everybody to be using evidence-based practices specifically around inclusion. And so I keep on repeating this phrase, evidence-based inclusion, evidence-based inclusion. Now, you've heard me say inclusion maybe 5, 6 times, but what does that even mean? And given that we're here reconstructing inclusion, it's probably worth talking about that, right? So I know, for regular members of the audience, you will have heard Amri, I always say, you would have heard Amri talking about this in a particular way. The way we talk about it is inclusion is a systematic business strategy to ensure that everyone shares the same advantages and benefits. So everyone can perform, everyone can belong, everyone can reach their potential. And what I like and what balances well with the book, which I have read, is the systems approach that you would be used to as a member of this audience. And so we consider all of this inclusion dream. We're on a path, an inclusion journey, and I'm constantly encouraging you to make better decisions. So when I
Mm.
say evidence-based inclusion, I want you to take evidence, gather evidence from 4 key areas. The research. What does the research say? And we can get into some of that later.
Hmm. Hmm.
What do the stakeholders say? The people who you are trying to help or
Right.
influence, or who are going to be influenced by the decision you make, that better decision? What do they say about all this? It's worth speaking to them. Then what does your organization say? Now, people talk a lot about data, collecting data. What does data mean? And there is a difference between that and evidence. And of course, you, professional expertise, your professional experience and other people's, which is why I have already benefited from Amri's personal experience, professional experience, because I've read the book, I've read his stuff. So it's not just about me and what I think and I'm clever. No, I get to benefit from what everyone else is saying, and in particular, the author of Reconstructing Inclusion.
I should bring you on every episode just so you can say that. And I almost wish that you had been the reader of my audiobook, because I'm like, wow, this is that voice, man. We would sell, when British people talk, people listen more. So obviously I would probably sell more audiobooks.
Yeah,
So
if you wanted to sound, if you wanted the author to sound like a villain from a James Bond movie, right? That's the other thing.
I can't fall out of my chair like we often do when we talk. But yeah, but I think I think I'd be okay with it, because I'm into to the villains as much as I am into the heroes. So so thank you for sharing that. Can you go a little deeper, Jonathan, into why evidence-based inclusion? Why is it important? What's the most compelling reason for organizations to adopt evidence-based inclusion over other things? And one of the things that you just talked about was evidence versus data. And that's not a distinction that I think very many people are familiar with. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. So yeah, so you'll hear, let's talk about decision making in general when it
Okay.
comes to inclusion. So if we travel a little bit back in time, 2020, murder of George Floyd, COVID, right? Many of us, most of us were under some sort of quarantine, whatever you want to call it, right? And there's all controversy around all of that stuff. So we were in a heightened sense where we're all looking at our screens, and the narrative around what we'll call DEI, right? And I'll say diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? As a catch-all term. The narratives were very emotive. Organizations felt as if we need to do something. We need to be seen to be doing something. Okay. So what is that thing? Where are we trying to go? What are we trying to achieve? There wasn't that much effort put into those things. And what you did find people doing is what I inherited this term, flags, food, and fun.
Mm.
I first heard this term from someone called Fernando Serpa, right? And
Yeah, I remember hearing it from Robert Rodriguez in his book on ERGs too. Yeah.
yes, yes,
Uh,
yes. Yeah. See, look, that's a deep cut, by the way, for the DEI people, like Dr. Robert Rodriguez, this book on DEI. Yeah. And I think he's got a book called Latino Talent or something.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that's a deep cut. I want to draw that attention to that. Most people wouldn't know the host, Amri, just said. So please put that in the show notes. This is just another shout out. Seriously, I've never heard anyone mention that book before, ever. Right. So just putting that out there. So there wasn't enough rigor around the decision making. And so the flags, food, and fun meant that people were going to have parties. They were going to have panel events. Cinco de Mayo, let's get some food. It's Black History Month. Let's get some food. Let's celebrate. And if you notice, a lot of those things, the people who you're interested in, whether it's, let's say, members of the Latino community or African Americans or the Black community, or it's Pride Month, whoever we're talking about, a lot of the time, those events placed those individuals outside of a typical workplace environment. There's photos, we're having parties
Yeah.
and everything else. So to a large extent, it didn't actually do the thing that you wanted it to
Mm,
do if
mm.
you had actually taken time to do that. So evidence-based inclusion allows you to just make better decisions about what you want to achieve, understanding how you're going to do it. And it brings it back to something that we're all familiar with in an organizational environment, which is some sort of performance management process in the end, which
Mhm,
is
mhm.
plan, do, review. Plan, do, review. Everyone's got a model. Everyone's got some
Right.
sort of hierarchy or anything. But ultimately, at some point, we do need to come back to plan, do, review in terms of what we've actually done. So evidence-based inclusion is the little bit that comes before. That's what we're arguing. But it makes sure that you're very consistent in what you're doing. I want to give another example just to really drill this home. And I think you'll like this one. We say there's a rhetorical problem in diversity and inclusion. And what that means is, according to Greek rhetoric, and I think this is from Aristotle as well, right? The book
Mhm.
Rhetoric, which sad enough to say I've got somewhere here, right? But
you're not alone. but continue. It's you can wait. If I change my camera, you probably see it. Yeah.
absolutely, right? So that as it goes, and I'd love you to think for yourself, does this sound true? In order to have a compelling argument or compelling case, a persuasive statement, you need three things. You need logos, pathos, ethos, right? Logos is the logic. Does this thing make sense? Does it stack up? Does it sound reasonable? Ethos, this is actually the credibility of the person who's saying it. So if I was here talking about traveling to Mars and telling you how we're going to achieve that, and I don't have the credibility to do that, you probably shouldn't believe me when I talk about those things. And then the last thing is ethos. And this is often about it's about the beliefs and values. We can go into that, but often people use an emotional appeal, right? And so you need each of those three things: ethos, pathos, logos. The rhetorical problem of diversity and inclusion is people rely too much on the emotional argument, the emotional appeal, without actually the person who's speaking having the credibility to make the claim, the statement, whatever they're trying to say, and without having a logical step about what we're going to do next. So to go even deeper on that, let's talk about unconscious bias training, which everyone says you need to do unconscious bias training to sort out. Actually, we don't even know what it is, but let's say we want to increase diversity. Let's do unconscious bias training, because the reason we don't have enough diversity, whatever we're saying that is because we have biases. We're not aware of them. Once we're aware of them, that's going to fix diversity.
Of course, naturally.
Naturally. Does it work? We know that everyone's doing it, right? Does it work? Well, using our evidence-based inclusion strategy, we look at what the research says.
Mm-hmm.
The research says that it actually doesn't work. There's no robust evidence to show that it works. And when I say the research, I'm not talking about one article. I'm not talking about 2 articles. I'm not talking about 20 articles. I'm talking about the body of research on this specific topic. And so that's really important. So that's where the evidence-based inclusion comes in. But bringing that back to the triangle, we've got these emotional appeals, the logic, the reason it doesn't stack up.
Right.
And often the person who's telling us this doesn't have the credibility to make this claim. Maybe they heard it from someone else. Maybe they saw other people doing it and now they're pushing it on you. And because of that fear, you may say yes. Now, once again, for members of the audience, you may have done unconscious bias training. Did it work? Did they check? Did they use the plan, do, review? Did anyone come back to see what happened? These are some of the issues we have. This is why we try and make it a little bit more robust with our evidence-based inclusion practice.
Yeah. You know, I started doing unconscious bias training with Howard Ross in like 2003, 2004, right?
Another deep cut.
Howard's written books on it now. And honestly, I think I built programs when I was inside, and we were trying to create a body of education and how it worked into processes and systems. But a lot of what I was doing was just entertaining. And so was it effective? I'm like, some people would say that was a great course. I'm like, well, yeah, but the devil tells preachers that when they come down from the pulpit too. Is it actually true, right? And so, yeah, I think that to talk about this in terms of evidence based, but so the data doesn't say that unconscious bias training works, but the research is beyond that, because you've also gone in and talked to organizations to say, well, what did you do with it? So was it just something you did? Either, I don't like to always get into box checking, but did you do it because everybody else did it? Because you've talked about that in your writing.
Absolutely.
I did this because everybody else did it. Would you say that that's pathos, or would you say that that's like just a lack of logos or some combination thereof?
That's a great point. I suppose there's a form of reason, which is everyone's doing it. It's likely that it works.
Okay.
That's my sort of reasoning around why other people would do it. Because to try something different is a risk. And we want to go for the low risk thing when we actually don't know what we're doing, right?
Got it.
So that's one way. Also, I didn't answer your question about the data versus evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So a very useful way of thinking about this, data is my height, my age, your height, your age, right? Evidence, am I tall? Am I young? Am I old? Now, it's the same number, but now with some context and understanding, that becomes evidence. So evidence is typically used to make a claim, support a hypothesis, to undermine, challenge a hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a useful way to think about it. So
I like that. That's really easy to follow too. I'm going to shift a little bit. You know, you read Reconstructing Inclusion, did a review on it. I'm eternally grateful for that. And I talked in the book about the current tenor of DEI, and I was concerned that we were going to get this massive pushback because a lot of the pathos was driving the conversation to an extent that I believe in rhetoricians, the rhetorically gifted. I talk about that in the book, but they need to have both some credibility by actually doing the work. They don't have to be at the high level of so-called expert, but they need to put in some time. They need to have some logic behind what they're saying, and they can include their lived experience or emotional experiences or senses that they have. That's fine. But what I saw this past few years since the death of George Floyd, and some people are starting to question whether it was a murder or a death, and that's another episode. We'll get into that. But given the current tenor of DEI in the media, meaning the defense of the pushback by people that are like us, that are practitioners, and then some companies wondering, where does this all go? We have this pushback on both sides, those who are against, those who are for, pushing back on those who are against, while others are just pushing ahead, committed to their agenda. What's the opportunity for the DEI space to make evidence-based approaches to inclusion the norm? And can we get there?
Yeah, I think it's the smart move, because what is the pushback about? Typically, it's about things that are perceived to be unfair or bad practices. When someone says they dislike DEI, they're going to give an example of something that perhaps wasn't done well, was poorly implemented, poorly explained. If your first experience of DEI is just someone who claims to be an expert and you remember them doing a completely different job, and now they're now an expert on this thing, and you're thinking, but why? What are you saying? It doesn't make sense. You know, there's too many mic drop moments. A great example is when people are talking about race and racism. And if you think, okay, there is a sociology of race that describes racism as a system of advantage or disadvantage depending on your racial identity, right? So it says race is socially constructed. And the argument is, if you are white, you benefit from this system of racism. Okay. Now, the typical person in the world thinks of racism as discrimination. Okay. If I called you a name, or if I treated you differently because of your racial identity, most people think of that as racism. So this sort of like academic intellectualization of racism, there's a lot of mic drop moments where someone will say, if you're black, you can't be racist, right? Right. And follow this for a second, because of this system of advantage or disadvantage, and you are not a beneficiary of that. So why did I tell that little story? Because there are some DEI experts who get hired by a company and they'll say, black people can't be racist. Or they'll say, all white people are racist. And that's their opening conversation. And they're starting to use these words, and it's just confusing. Pretend that's your first.
Let me interject real quick, so everybody knows that Dr. Jonathan, when he said expert, he used air quotes. So continue with go.
This is true.
Continue with that, Dr. Jonathan.
So even the book, what's that Robin DiAngelo book, which I've read actually. We've all got it.
I just can't even stand to have it come out of my mouth. So it
Okay.
had something to do with fragile,
That's
but
it.
it's not anti-fragile. It's the
That's it.
opposite.
It's white
Yeah.
fragility. Okay. Now, if you read that book, you're gonna get bits like that. And there's a real leap, going back to logos, right? There's a real leap where it's like, okay, I understand what you're saying. And you're like, wow, okay. And these are the sorts of first experiences, first encounters that people have with DEI, right?
Mm.
And so it doesn't feel like it makes sense. It doesn't feel like it's inclusive, because now it feels that perhaps you're being attacked. And there's different
Right.
versions of this. This was the one I wanted to just raise. So there's not often this explanation of what's going on and why. And so getting back to your question, like this, why people are, there's a backlash. I think part of it is, of course, we saw what happened with the United States Supreme Court. That had an impact, of course. But I think there's been some bad actors who have contributed to make this easy for others. Not everyone agrees with me, but this is my view.
No,
There's a lot
we're
of
on the same page with that. And we
absolute.
hadn't even talked about that before, but I have this sense that I'm really big on this. I took these seminars earlier in my life and career, and in the seminars, it always talks about being cause in the matter and knowing that this world is interdependent. If you're a part of the observation of it, you've probably been contributing to it in some way, negative, positive, neutral. And if you can't see yourself in it, you're just kind of projecting. And so, in a way, you know, have we set this up as practitioners for attack? And my answer to myself is, we've been causing the matter to some extent. And we have to be able to be willing to put the mirror up to ourselves to say where we've missed the mark, where we've maybe made some advance, maybe where we've regressed. And I don't see us doing that so frequently.
I completely agree. If you think of an organization of 3,000 people, okay, to be the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, what sort of background would you need? What sort of
Mm.
experience would that
Yeah.
require?
Yeah. Yeah.
To be the Chief Executive Officer, to be the Chief Technology Officer, right? Now, if we look in many organizations and look at who the Chief Diversity Officer was, I'm not talking about the legit people who have got the experience, they've got the expertise, who've been doing this work, because that in a way that's comparable or appropriate for the C-suite level. There are many people who, okay, we used to run an ERG, employee resource group, and now you find yourself as the global lead. Things like that. So these contribute to the challenges. And so I think it's useful to just introduce rigor into this.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Evidence-based
Rigor.
inclusion does
Yep.
that. It introduces rigor. It makes it harder for people to argue against you because you're raising your standards. You're not, in fact, positioning yourself against people. You're positioning yourself as actually trying to solve a problem that matters to them.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a clear process about what you're doing, why. This is where the evidence comes from. Your mistakes become more evidence. You don't mistake common practice for best practice. And it's something that actually gives people comfort. So instead of having that fear of getting it wrong, instead of taking wild risks, announcing huge strategies, you're able to actually develop and iterate over time in a way
Mm-hmm.
that's consistent with everything else that happens in a successful, progressive organization.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way you lay that out. Is even a company strategy has a considerable amount of emergence. And oftentimes we have people that go into a DEI strategy that don't emerge with it. Like, so we've watched, the response to the death of George Floyd to be this kind of, let's go at all the racists and get them. And I'm like, you know, the racists can be the most supportive people you could ever meet. And you wouldn't even know they were racist if they in fact were. and calling all of people who have a certain hue racist is probably going to create more racist than it is more so-called anti-racist, right? And because it creates separation, and we know really we didn't solve for desegregation in the United States and anywhere else in the world through more separation. That's not how it works. That's not what the evidence tells us. So, so that's another
Indeed, right?
conversation, you know.
And all the
Um,
name calling doesn't help either.
oh my God, it's
And
actually like it's actually really exhausting. I don't know how people can persist in it unless it's to you know, just that's what their brand is. And so are you being kind of having allegiance to your brand without being able to emerge to meet the needs that the organization has to advance its mission, purpose, and people? And
absolutely.
that's a place where I get a little frustrated, and I don't always like to sound like I'm critical of DEI people, but I'm pretty critical of us. And I feel like I'm not that way because I don't love us. Actually, I'm that critical because I do. And then that's sometimes a place where I find myself like, man, I don't want to write so much on LinkedIn because sometimes I want to actually have a real dialogue with real people. And
Yeah.
it's hard to do that on social media. Jonathan, you said, this is something that I've actually quoted you on other podcasts and another writing I've had. One of your posts discussed the perception that some people have is DEI practitioners are grifters. They're not really legitimate. They're not really bringing any value. And you acknowledge that there are some people that are like that. You mindfully, you're not like me. You're really kind about it, but you haven't called people out or made any particular person wrong. But you did mention this notion of people that haven't necessarily come to the work with the right qualifications, and you mentioned that a bit earlier. How can evidence-based inclusion strategies mitigate the perception of some that DEI is a field that anyone can get into with any level of depth and still call themselves practitioners? Can it do that? And if not, what can elevate the credibility of those with depth?
I think so. The way I answer this question is something I seek inspiration from my PhD, right? So I'm I've got a background as an accountant. So in the UK, I'm a fellow now of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, right? I'm only a fellow because I've just been I paid the subscription for long enough, right? It's not like before I was just a member. But in my thesis, we talked about the notion of what a professional was. And typically that actually meant ethics. It meant esoteric knowledge, right? So it's knowledge, information, insights that are quite hard to come by. It also means there's a technology, and to have a profession, the technology you have needs to be superior to the alternatives. Also the notion of profession means that there's some sort of, well, the perfect ones have entry exams, they've got a body. It would be amazing if there was something like that in this space. I think it would be very difficult for that to happen in the short term, at least. But I think it's useful to try to mimic these things. So, what is your continuing professional development? What expertise do you have? What are your values? What does integrity mean? What is the technology you use in terms of know-how and method in what you do and how you achieve it? I think the more you can communicate these things, the more your standards will be clear. And if you are unable to do these things, then the pursuit of these things will actually raise your standards as well. And so if mimicking or pursuing this archetype of professional identity, I think is the way forward outside of having an organized professional body that would do all of this. And that's what I've tried to do because I thought, okay, as an accountant, these are the 5, 10 things that all professions have. Look at doctors, look at lawyers, and doctors and lawyers, by the way, they're more perfect. Accountants are insecure because they haven't perfected what they call the professionalization process. Anyone can call themselves an accountant. In the same way, everyone can call themselves a coach. Not everyone can call themselves he's laughing, by the way, when I'm saying this, but it's true. Anyone can call themselves an accountant. Anyone can call themselves a coach. So those two words don't actually have that much meaning without some sort of professional rigor. When someone tells you they're an MD, when someone tells you that they're a lawyer, there's so many things that you can take for granted because they've perfected this professionalization project.
Right,
So
right.
what I do myself and what I encourage others to do is to follow that, to develop that. So evidence-based inclusion is my technology. That's what I do. I constantly share what my bias is as well. My continuing professional development is these books, the research I talk about. I've got a podcast as well. That's my mixtape. You heard him talking about mixtapes earlier? That's my mixtape. So you get to decide before and this raises the standard. Doesn't mean that everybody's going to choose you. That doesn't matter. Everyone's able to make an informed, reasoned choice.
So, and we're moving towards closing. Can people elevate beyond the calling themselves something? And by taking this evidence-based approach, and I'll add something on to that, when an organization is looking for somebody to help them work through this conversation, I think it's starting to parse itself out in the marketplace. People are seeing through the grifting that you've mentioned before. But how can organizations make sure that they secure somebody who's actually going to help them elevate the organizational culture processes, create the conditions for people to thrive, give them and help them build those tools so that they can do that long term and continue to cultivate it longer term with their folks? How would you counsel somebody to make a decision about who they could work with and kind of deciphering,
Now
filtering
that's a
out?
great question. So if I'm an organization looking for someone to help me with this stuff and I don't know what to do, and the good news is we are in the 21st century. So in the 20th century, you'd ask a friend and then you would only discover, basically someone's going to come and make a presentation to you, but really you're trusting your friend. Okay. In the 21st century, you can think for yourself. So I would look for someone who is demonstrating expertise already. I would look for someone who I already know their values, beliefs, and I would also try and get a win before I contact them. So are they sharing their technology, their ideas, their perspective? Do they give me something so that I can already do this independently? If the answer is yes, then what I would do, I would say, okay, and I would try and use what they're saying already. I would also try and understand what this means compared to other people. And frankly, evidence-based inclusion is a tactic that would help you with that thought process. So I'd go, okay, what does the research say about how solving this problem? Okay, because there is research about diversity practitioners. Then I would speak to my friends as well. Then I would actually think about the problem we're looking at in the organization. But also, I would then see, does this person give me something before I pay them that can help me? If the answer is yes, like you've got a book, read the book. If you like that book, maybe there's a very good chance that this person could help us with our problem. And we've already read the book and we solved 1, 2, 5% of it. Maybe they can take us the rest of the 95%. You know, that's the approach I would take. Don't
Sure.
trust someone who says they can help you. Trust someone who's already helped you. That is the smart move, in my opinion.
Yeah. Now he says it and he backs it up. And so, because there's lots of stuff that Dr. Jonathan generously gives away. I said at the beginning of this broadcast, and I'll say it again: if you're not connected, if you're not following, you're missing a bunch of what he calls free. But obviously, somebody had to pay something to allow it to be what it is when he produces it and puts it out there for the world. So it's free to you, but it's free ain't free. So Dr. Jonathan, is there anything else that I should have asked you that I didn't, that you'd like to add to our conversation?
I suppose the one thing, like the starting point for everyone, I would say, like, what do you do? Because it's one thing to, okay, check out podcasts, books, social media. I would say what I have learned in my research, in my evidence-based practice, is that you're likely to be facing what we call the three biggest problems: people, potential, performance. And I would try and figure out what this means to you. So people is, who are the people you're trying to include, right? You'll probably have some sort of sense of that, right? Potential, you're probably struggling to have a culture of inclusion where everyone can meet their potential. So try and understand what your culture encourages right now. And once again, it's so obvious, it may even be difficult for you to analyze it, right? There's some unspoken truths, narratives that just happen. You don't even talk about it. It happened. You wouldn't even question it. It would literally take someone else to bring it up, or someone who bumps up against it for you to recognize it's a thing. And initially, you won't even want to acknowledge it as a thing. And then the third thing is performance, like this so-called business case for diversity. And there's a whole, we could have had a whole podcast on that, right? But the real thing is, what does diversity, equity include? What do these words mean? And what do they mean for you in your specific organization? Not that person, not what that expert says, you in your organization, using everyday language that people get. That is the key. If you focus and start on those three things, you're going to be way ahead of everyone anyway. And then when you do need a consultant, or when you do need help, you would have a much clearer idea about who to look for, and it's gonna be more beneficial to you. So that's what I'd encourage you to think about. Three biggest problems. That's a great starting point, and it will protect you from some of these grifters.
Fantastic. People, potential, performance, and the avoidance of grifters. To end our time together, Dr. Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey, thank you for again just being exemplary in this space and being somebody who I aspire to learn from every day. And I do learn something from you every day. And so thank you for being on the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast.
Thank you for having me. Wishing you the best. I appreciate your support. I appreciate all the work and the positive energy and the clarity that you're putting out there as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. And to the audience, I hope this was helpful. Make it a great day. Peace. If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.